I'm Burton Hunter. My parents named me John Burton Hunter III after my dad and my great-grandpa. I was born in March of 1946, one of the early baby boomers. I'm 72 years of age, and yet I'm here to give a little bit of the history that led up to my ownership of this fantastic Ford Focus RS that I acquired here at Jenkins Ford after being a Subaru WRX owner for about 12 to 15 years. I'm a trial attorney. I have to be in the courtroom sometimes 3 and 4 and 5 times a week. More often than not, over in family court. Have to be willing to take on smart people, have confidence, and be able to express myself. How does a person gain the confidence, the self-confidence to be able to do that? With me, it wasn't because I was naturally good at sports. Because when I was perhaps 5 years of age, I remember in Wheeling Park at my home in Wheeling, a group of about 100, perhaps 200 kids lined up for a sprint race. I took 2 or 3 steps, fell flat on my face, and watched the fannies of all the other kids run away as I got up and never quite got up to speed. Did better in high school sports and was able to play for my small school, Lindsley Military Institute, and start the 8th, 9th, 10th grade until a shallow socket caused chronic dislocation. The only other athletic endeavor I had is I put a big harness on and I played fraternity flag football, which I actually was okay at. But I'm relatively slow, a little bit shorter than average height, and not a natural athlete. So how do I go from there to being where I am here? I was fortunate to have some wonderful youth activities. I began to get some confidence in my ability to do things if I could figure out a role to play. Then I met my wonderful wife, and she was kind enough to marry me, and I was on my way. But I'm going to be talking today more about one little element of my life, and I hope you understand, I'm not here to brag, an element of my life that it turned out that I was very good at, and I was able to use the resources of B&R Ford, predecessor to Jenkins, to exercise that talent. I've had a love affair with cars all the way back to 1950 when my father had a Ford convertible and I dropped down behind the seats without no seat belts. My mother looked back and screamed, "He's gone," and I ended up getting a whipping for that one. My dad owned a 1961 Pontiac Bonneville and a Chrysler 300 and also a 57 Chrysler New Yorker. I got to take that Bonneville to the military ball at Lindsley Military Institute. Over the years, I've had some neat cars as an adult, a BMW 2002, an Opel Manta Rally, a Fiat 850 Spider, and then and a SSEI Pontiac Bonneville with a supercharged engine. Then I stumbled upon a WRX 2002, a rally car, and I had WRXs for about 13 years. And I wish I still had one. This is the car that replaced it. This is my Ford Focus RS. I'll be talking a little later of how I obtained this. But my love of cars has been at the heart of the subject we're talking about today. I credit a change in my life to 2 of my friends. I won't give their full names, but John and Ray, both college roommates, different years. John had an Austin Healey 3000 and later had a slew of interesting cars, including a 327 Corvette Stingray. Ray had an MGB 64, or maybe 66. I ended up with a 68, which I totaled. I'm sorry. Still feel bad about it. Still carry scars from that. Don't drive too fast and keep your seatbelt on. Ray had something called a Corvair Corsa, which was quite an interesting car. And we would rally around Buchanan here at West Virginia Wesleyan. We would talk cars with each other, and basically we would boost each other's interest in cars. They are now friends. I've never been able to get them to the Skip Barber Racing School, and neither one of them is driving a hot car today, but they are still great guys. I mentioned my friends Ray and John. Ray has the MGB, with bad shocks, by the way. He tells me that he's going to go to a race called the Sports Car Club of America national race in Cumberland, Maryland, at their airport, which they call Cumberland Raceway. Would I go? No, I was too busy. So he invites John. How he didn't invite John first, he never explained, but probably John had already said no. But he invited John. John said yes. All of a sudden, Burt wanted to go. Well, Burt is 5'8", almost. John's 6'3". After a lot of begging, the rule was Burt had to curl himself up behind the seats of a two-seater on the ledge and could not get out to get in the front seat at all. So off we go to Cumberland. John is headed to Vietnam as a Marine line officer. I didn't know it at the time because Ray was a year behind, but Ray ended up going to combat in the Army. Great guys, I love them, and I stay in touch with them today. I won't give you all the details, except we got a loaf of bread, a pound of bologna, a jar of mayonnaise, and a plastic fork, and that was our meal for the whole weekend. And we show up at the track, and I was mesmerized. You can't believe what was there. There were McLarens with the stacks, there were Lolas, there were bathtub Porsches, there were Formula Vs, there were all the classes of Sports Car Club of America, and there was the beautiful Donna Mae Mims in a Yanko Stinger Corvair Corsa. Something told me I could do that. Even though Ray was the fast driver in the fraternity, I thought I could do that. Now, I did want to mention that my dad, who's an insurance man, was able to get a great deal on a Buick Skylark 1965 with a 300 cubic inch with a 4-barrel, 250 horsepower with bucket seats. So I got to drive around campus second half of my sophomore year for 2 years with that car, which was replaced, traded in by the MGB 1968, which I've already mentioned that I totaled. So that's where the first virus of the racing bug got into my bloodstream. I could spend an hour or so about my courtship of the beautiful Nancy Goodfellow, who I met at the freshman mixer at West Virginia Wesleyan in August or early September 1964. As interesting as it is, she's relatively private, and I'm going to fast forward to when we have one child, about this big, and another one just about, who's 8 months and a half along, and we arrive at Lime Rock Park. I don't know if it was that weekend, but very close in time, I was watching at Lime Rock, Sports Car Club of America, and IMSA races. A guy was racing a Datsun 510. His name was P.L. Newman. I wanted to look up his movie. I think it was Winning. At about 40 years of age, Paul Newman became caught up in racing, and we would race at the same tracks but with different classes of cars for the next couple of years. But there was a fellow named Dave Rush. Dave's wife, Georgette, introduced herself to us 2 months ago at Festival Friday, and I learned that my old racing partner had died a couple years ago. But Dave was racing a Pinto out of Buchanan, a Ford Pinto. Yes, it was a very competitive, very robust car, and by then they'd done the fix of the little gasoline tank problem that they'd had. And Dave and I began to talk about the possibility of a racing team. I'll go ahead and explain that he offered me a deal, $2,000 cash. I just got my first big personal injury settlement I mentioned earlier that I'm a trial lawyer. And that should have been put away for our savings, our retirement, our vacation, but it was sitting there. That's like $200 a week, race weekend, and I was going to have a full race-capable car. Now, these were showroom stock cars, a special class that had been born at Summit Point Raceway at the D.C. region of the Sports Car Club of America, but it was a rather premier group because there were about 40 cars qualified for this. The national champion had come out of there, and it's where it was born. So here I was getting ready to be involved in amateur sports car racing. Dave and I went out to Tolmansville Road, and I drove it fast and no doubt amateurish. Scared us both a little bit, but that's how the partnership started. Dave and I went up to Pennsylvania, and I can't remember the town, at an auction, and I can't remember which of his two Pintos he purchased. The green one, that is in some of the photographs in the local newspaper. By the way, there are about 20 articles in the Record Delta newspaper authored by Jim Warner, but ghostwritten by Dave and me about our racing exploits. That's the only way that I've got any of the detail of what happened back then. I've reread those articles, and I'm so happy they did it. But Dave and I approached Paul Ritter. He was the R and B&R Ford, predecessor to Jenkins Ford, about a sponsorship. And my recollection is the free parts and labor totaled about $1,500 a year. That was our sponsorship. And we were in the newspaper. They photographed our cars. Dave knew a fellow that owned a Formula Ford. His name was Gene Tolbert, out of the either Baltimore or DC area. That was going to be our team, and we were going to have exploits as racing drivers. In order to do that, I discovered that I had to have two racing schools. I'd always heard about the Skip Barber Racing School. Skip had been an international level driver. I got to know him, wonderful man. He's still alive, and his name is still associated with the racing school. And I was back with Aaron Kittle, videographer from Jenkins Ford, lapping this car, my Ford Focus RS, as sort of a final act in my high-speed driving. And so I think that's why I'm here today. Long story short, that was a fun 3 days in which I ended up sitting in the seat that had been sat moments before by Joanne Woodward, Paul Newman's wife. Paul and Joanne were at the Red Lion Inn. We walked in, the staff was still all excited, and when I said why, they told me, and I said which side sat on my side, and they said Mrs. Newman. So I got to feel the heat from the seat of Mrs. Newman's seat. Long story short, the fellow I was with that day was a pilot with Allegheny Airlines that's now defunct, and I ended up going to a school in Rockingham, North Carolina, and getting to drive on a high-banked oval because the car had been vandalized, so when we showed up at Summit Point Raceway for my second school, it could not be used that day. But I finished that, which gave me novice status, which meant I would drive this car through the mountains across the Potomac Highlands to Summit Point Raceway, and that's where we began the racing career. I need to slow down just a little bit and explain why in the world would anybody be racing a Pinto or a Fiesta or a Mazda sedan, or back then the hot car was a VW Rabbit. I took great pleasure when I could beat the VW Rabbits. Well, it's because they decided that they needed a class that could be open to large numbers of people, that would not be cost prohibitive, could actually be the family driver, and turned out to be a big hit. It spread nationwide, and I've been in fields of 50 and 60 cars. Since there's A class and a B class, and we're the C class, that means going into the hairpin, in the first turn, I would be behind 20 cars, and because I was qualifying well, I would be ahead of 30 cars. And you don't think those cars go fast, but the chaos of what happens at the end of that straight when 50 cars are jockeying for position is pretty amazing. So I raced at Summit Point. I got my first points. We drove all night with my friend John, the very same friend John that helped get me into this in the first place, was my entire crew. We raced up there. I missed the first practice. I followed a friend around for the second practice. According to the record delta, I slipped off the track and either spun or almost spun 3 times, passed 3 more cars, and finished 4th. You got points for either 5 or 6. I know it was at least 5. And I'll go ahead and say it right now. According to the reporting back then, and I think it was accurate because it was all fresh in our mind, in the time I raced, at the point where I got to 27 races, I had been in the points 24 times. I had finished first place 5 times. I had finished 4th in my one national race, which is where the lap record in that race set by the national champion, Mr. Jordan, was broken in that race. I managed to finish 4th there. I got the lap record for fastest lap at the short part of the track at Watkins Glen. I'm saying that out of amazement because of a mediocre history of any kind of athletics, but this one thing really seemed to click. It was a very interesting thing. We got to the end of the season, second race from the end. I was leading according to the newspaper report, which was accurate, I'm sure, because I wrote it. I was 500 feet ahead, and I came down the chute where I eventually had the wreck the next race there. And I spun. And I went from 1st to 7th and then passed a couple cars and finished 5th. So I ended up 1 point behind in the series, the whole championship, the Mid-Atlantic Road Racing Series at that point. All I had to do was win the last race, of course, and I would win the series as a rookie. I did want to mention, being a novice in a Pinto, that meant they put 3 stripes of racing tape on the side of your car. People would know to steer clear of you. And my first 3 races, I was a novice, and everybody had to do that. The guy that came in first in the race where I spun, and that was Dave Rothell, he had the misfortune or the good fortune twice during the season to have the same problem happen. His muffler disconnected from his tailpipe mysteriously, which gave him 5 horsepower more, and in each case he passed the car that had been leading him and he won the race. So going into the last race, I found that I was also leading. But this time, the other guy, tailpipe came off, caught up with me, passed me with a big blat as I heard a car with no tailpipe, straight pipe going through. And as we came down the last straight, the chute again, the fellow in front of me spun. I hit him. My friend Mike Delaney T-boned me. I ended up 5th because they red flagged the race. And the fellow that's in the background of the photograph I have in my office, Dave, he won that. But I did end up 2nd in that series. So that's phase 1. That was the first of 2 seasons that I raced. That was a tough time for the B&R Ford racing team. My mentor, Dave Rush, who was racing national level races, he was racing in national competition races. I was racing in regional races, the Mid-Atlantic Road Racing Series, and also the Washington, D.C. Series. That car that got T-boned that I drove at the end, the last race of my season, was the car Dave was to take to Road Atlanta. That car was too banged up. A $2,000 car had over $1,000 damage. I paid to repair it. There's no such thing as insurance. And Dave never told me he was mad at me, and he understood the fellow in front of me spun. We lapped him in a 20-mile race we lapped him. That means we went 2 miles farther than he did. Very frustrating. So the next year we each had our own cars, and I bought a Ford Fiesta, a new one, 1979. We put all the B&R Ford stuff on it, and that was a remarkable little car. I ended up with 2 first-place finishes at Watkins Glen. I did not break my old lap record that was in the Pinto, but that car was an absolute marvel in the rain. So I was able to keep up with the B-class BMW sedans and cars like that. So as we went along, there I was in first or second place again in the series. This time I was going to make it work, but I stretched my tires one race weekend too long. And as I am driving up at Nelson Ledges in Ohio, I get a flat tire. By the time I get that fixed and get out there, something had happened from the flat tire. And while I'm second in the series and either first or second in the race, because the flat tire was during practice, it wasn't in the race, I lost everything. The hub broke, my wheel broke, and at 60 or 65 miles per hour, I go directly towards the tire wall. I hit that tire wall, it gathers me up like mother's arms, bounces me back out, and on the way to that tire wall, I said I retired. So I didn't have the last race or two of the 1980 season, but I had a great time. Again, at that point, I was second in the points. I never bothered to find out where I was after the next 2 races. But it was a heck of a time. I ended up owning that car for several years. It was a fantastic car. The next year, I went back to the Skip Barber Racing School. Bruce McGinnis was my teacher. He's the guy that took over the Datsun 510 seat from P.L. Newman, who moved on to a Datsun 240Z. And we went up to Breyer Motor Park in New Hampshire. And I said, Bruce, I've been racing sedans for 2 years. Everything's softer. Everything's different. I don't think I want to take this formula car up to speed too fast. He said, Bert, the guy in front of you is going to be the next great racer in Argentina. You got to try to keep up with him. So, idiot that I was, I did try to keep up with him. I couldn't make the shift work because the short little throws were so much different than my Pintos and Fiesta, which gave me so much more leeway. I'm looking down at that. I hit the marbles. I spin around. I back into the guardrail. I tell Bruce I'm done. 2 days left in my 3-day school. I go back to the motel. Tears flow, and it wasn't my wife's, it was mine, begging for forgiveness, telling her we now owed Skip Barber $1,000 for his deductible in his car, and that I would never race again. So I'm sorry this part's long, but it ties right in. I call Skip Barber on Monday and I said, Skip, I blew the family budget. I feel so bad. I didn't finish the race, and can I get any kind of a discount because I didn't race for the last 2 days? He said, Bert, it's all my fault. Breyer Park is a nightmare. 8 people damaged the car up there because the guardrails are so close. No runoff, no room for air. He said, forget about the $1,000. So no one is ever going to be a bigger fan of Skip Barber than Burt Hunter. Fast forward 35 years. 9 years ago, in my BMW, brand new BMW, my brand new WRX, Subaru WRX, I end up at Lime Rock Park, a second or so slower than I was back then, racing a Formula car at Skip Barber with my buddy, the racing mechanic Casey, and a brand new gynecologist who brought her dad there for his birthday, and we had a ball. So the last part of this, I'll explain how this RS ties all that together and how I ended up back at Lime Rock with Aaron Jenkins, videographer, this summer. I mentioned earlier that I became a Subaru guy. 2002, I know 2009, and one in between that I bought for my son. I had 3 WRXs and just loved them. Bill Minsker decided not to sell them anymore, so I had to buy it from Myers, I think. Well, doggone it, it became Jenkins Subaru Hyundai. So I'm over here getting some of my Subaru work done at Jenkins Ford, since I'm a Buchanan boy. Joey Jenkins walks by and we have small talk, and I ask him about this Ford Focus I'd heard. I didn't actually understand the difference between an SVT and a RS. But he says, yeah, we're getting one of those in, the only one this year. And I said, call me if it turns out. I checked a time or two. Nobody seemed to know anything about it. But I did send an email, and I said, have Ron Sheets send me an email or call me if that ever comes in. So at 11 o'clock one Saturday while my wife and I were working, I get the email, you want to test drive this thing. So we came over, we test drove it. The one thing about the Subaru my wife did not like was the seats. She always felt that she was down in a hole. We tried this out, and lo and behold, the Recaro seats are adjustable up and down. My wife loves it. A couple days later, we own the Ford Focus RS. I got thinking about it. I did some emailing, and I discovered that there's a group called Sports Car Drivers Association. Elevon Goulart somehow got this thing started, and all ages and pocketbook owners of various cars do high-speed lapping with supervision from trainers all over, and doggone if they didn't do one at Lime Rock. Long story short, I did some emailing, some calling. Aaron got in the thread, and for a certain amount of money, I end up with 2 days of lapping at Lime Rock. I invite Aaron to come up, stay at the Interlaken, and watch me do my thing, and doggone he did. And he put a GoPro right up in the windshield. I got through 4 25-minute sessions, 3 of them with a guide, which I sort of wish we didn't have. They had me unlearn the things that I knew about that track that made me go fast, but that's the way they were teaching the non-racing drivers. But the last time I just went out and let it all go. I could have gone one more, but I got my fill. I promised my wife that's all I'm going to do. I was on the track with 600 horsepower Mustangs with a Ferrari. I wasn't there at the same time, but there was a $200,000 McLaren there. Just all sorts of fabulous cars, including the spec Miata race cars that the Skip Barber school uses. And I had a great time. At age 72, I had a little apprehension I'd never had before. But 46 years into my legal career, knowing I had to be oh, by the way, I do want to say I've got 4 wonderful children, 6 beautiful grandchildren. We dragged those poor kids to the races. They loved it. We put a platform on our van. They watched the races from up there. Sometimes I'd bring them back with tape across their ear because they cut it badly, and Mom would get all upset. But we just had a wonderful time. One anecdote is I went 3 weeks before my wife was to have our son Justin, and a state trooper arrived at the track, asked me if I was who I am. I said I was, and he said, well, congratulations, you're a father. My wife had gone into labor 3 weeks early. A dear friend had taken her to the hospital. She'd had our son. I got back from Summit Point in under 3 hours. Try to do that. And we came over Route 50. And it was just an amazing experience, and she's reminded me of it a time or two. But racing has been a fun part of my life. It did help put together the pieces of the puzzle that made me who I am, a fairly self-assured fella, thankful as can be, happy I never got hurt, happy I was always able to get the cars back from the race. And that's the story. I thank Jenkins Ford. The racing stripes are mine, suggested by that same friend, John, that's been part of the story for a long time. I put 35,000 miles on this car. I've had a blast. You wouldn't want to take it up your rough, rocky driveway because it really is a performance type car. 350 horsepower, 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds, 4 driving modes including drift mode, Recaro seats, special steering wheel, and it's got the amenities too. So I'm not doing a commercial, but I certainly could recommend this car. And by the way, I've had to have a Ford Focus loaner for reasons I won't get into right now. And great little car, only costs about a third as much as this one. So either way, I've not always been a Ford guy, obviously with my WRX and my history, but right now I couldn't be happier.